What is the libertarian perspective on the 4th of July? Join Richard Ebeling and me in this week's Libertarian Angle as we examine that question. Hi, I'm Jacob Hornberger, president of the Future of Freedom Foundation, and welcome to this week's Libertarian Angle, the show that brings you all the principled case for the libertarian philosophy. I'm joined by my co-host, Richard Ebeling, professor of economics at the Citadel. Richard, good to see you again.
Good to see you and to be with our viewers and listeners.
Yeah, thank you all for tuning in. We're actually recording this Libertarian Angle the day before the 4th of July. You'll be seeing it after the 4th of July. But Richard, I thought this was a good opportunity to discuss Independence Day, the principles of the Declaration of Independence, 4th of July, and talk a little bit about libertarian perspectives on what happened on that fateful day and the principles that surround the 4th of July. I think that the most significant thing about the 4th of July is not the fact that the military battles that were going to take place as part of winning American independence from the British Empire. I think the most significant thing about the 4th of July is the Declaration of Independence, and specifically the unbelievably radical sentiments that were put into that document. Now, I'm not referring to the reasons for the break with the British Empire. I'm really referring to the principles that Thomas Jefferson enunciated in this document that, we all sort of take for granted today, but are really very, very radical sentiments. I mean, sentiments that shock the world. They went against the grain of thinking that had been characterizing mankind throughout history. And people just couldn't believe that there were sentiments like this being expressed. And what I'm referring to is where Jefferson writes that everybody has been endowed with certain unalienable, natural, God-given rights that include life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And of course, by including, I mean that doesn't mean that the list is limited to those three things. But what Jefferson is saying about this is saying to protect these natural God-given rights, which obviously pre-exist government, governments are brought into existence to preserve them, to preserve their exercise. So in other words, he's saying our rights don't come from government. That's a shocking notion. Even today, it's a shocking notion to, I think, most Americans. It was certainly a shocking notion to the entire world because everybody throughout history has just accepted the notion that our rights come from government, and therefore government has the legitimate authority to regulate, control, manage, direct, command, control how we live our lives, and to seize our earnings, to fund government operations. And we throughout history, people have essentially served the government. And here Jefferson's coming along saying, we don't serve anybody. Our rights pre-exist government. Government is our servant that's called into existence to protect the exercise of these rights. Well, that is a shocking notion, Richard. And if you take, for example, the right that Jefferson lists here, the pursuit of happiness, I would say that most Americans that celebrate the 4th of July with the picnics and the fireworks and so forth, they haven't really given a lot of thought to this phrase. And if they have, they don't really agree with it. Because if you stop to think about it, the pursuit of happiness, if that really is a fundamental, natural, God-given right that pre-exists government, then that adheres to everybody in the world, then how come the government spends so much of its time controlling, directing, commanding, incarcerating, punishing people who are exercising in their own way the pursuit of happiness? And two things come to mind immediately, and that's the drug war, where they incarcerate people for ingesting drugs or possessing drugs. That very well may be the way people pursue happiness. You can sit here and say, well, I don't approve it. I don't think it's good. Like, consuming amounts of alcohol or tobacco is not good. But from a libertarian standpoint, we'd say, well, that's a person's right to pursue happiness in his own way. But most Americans don't believe that. And certainly federal officials don't believe it. And I'd also apply it to immigrants, foreigners. If that right the pursuit of happiness adheres to everyone in the world, which is what Jefferson's saying, not just to Americans, then why are we jailing people for trying to pursue happiness, each in his own way? What do you think, Richard?
Well, I think that a point that you raised, the uniqueness of the Declaration, was something that many, many people in Europe understood, both during the Revolution and certainly after the success and then the United States was set up, beginning in 1790, 1791. Europeans who were in sympathy with it would refer to it as the great experiment for mankind. Could human beings be self-governing without the authority of a king, a prince, an overlord, who would determine their position in society, their social setting, what their proper station in life would be in terms of income and standard of living, that individuals could be self-governing. Now, in one sense, self-governing did mean as a republic. That is, the people themselves vote for the representatives who will hold political offices for the purposes of promulgating and enforcing those laws meant to protect each citizen's rights. But the other sense of self-governing, which was no less important and understood, was that in this American experiment, the other notion of self-governing meant the self-governing individual, not just people periodically would go into a voting booth and put a slip of paper into the box determining that they wanted Joe to hold this political office instead of Sam for a stipulated period of time. But the self-governing sense that the role of government was not to command and control people's lives. It was to secure their liberty in terms of their life, their liberty, and their honestly acquired property, to freely associate with their neighbors in that pursuit of happiness as they each individual sought. So no, the self-government meant you selected where you wanted to live. You chose the career or occupation or profession you wanted to follow. You determined what religious faith, if any, you wanted to practice, what human relationships you wanted to enter into, the provision of your and your family's needs and responsibilities, rather than a social welfare safety net that is imposed upon you to see that you get what others think you need and may not be thoughtful enough to provide for yourself. In other words, a self-governing individual was the idea that you're responsible for your life, either on your own or in free and voluntary association or exchange with others in and outside of the marketplace. This was a unique experiment, an experiment that was seen as the hope for mankind, because if the Americans could show its success, then perhaps it could be practiced by others around the world. That was the ideal. And while it seems strange to us today, most Americans, the large majority of Americans, considered it right, normal, and natural for them to have this liberty, where government is the law court, the policeman, maybe the soldier to protect the jurisdiction of the United States from a foreign aggressor. But beyond those fundamental duties and some other ones that might be assigned by a local or state government, the state basically did not infringe, command, restrain, control, impede, subsidize, or in any way attempt to direct the paths that you chose to follow as an individual human being. That's what made America unique and was captured in that phrase that you correctly hammered away at. When Thomas Jefferson says, we hold these truths to be self-evident, like reflect a moment. Do you want to be a slave? Do you want to be a serf? Do you want others to command and control your life instead of you? We therefore say it's self-evident that all men are created equal, not some men are meant to be masters and many to be slaves, and that they are endowed by their creator with certain unalienable rights. That is, you were born with them. And you notice it's universal, as you pointed out too. It's not saying, oh, certain and unalienable rights that people who luckily are on the eastern seaboard of North America have, but everyone else doesn't. No, they talk about the universality of these individual rights. And what are they? Life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And in fact, in the original draft of the Declaration that Jefferson had been working on, he in fact included private property. But that was presumed so self-evident to follow from life and liberty that it wasn't for us considered necessary to articulate it in the document itself. So this is what America was about, and what the celebrations of the anniversary of the Declaration of Independence what was being recalled and appreciated when 4th of July came around in the 19th century and even in the early part of the 20th century. But now, when people, set off the fireworks, have their hamburgers, brats, and side dishes, they're just thinking it's a good time and to watch a sports game. And the idea of why they're doing this has been lost. And that, of course, serves the interests of those who want to deny us liberty, those in or outside of the political process who basically want to be the political paternalists, the social engineers who believe that they know what is better for each of our lives than we ourselves as individuals.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right to bring up the U.S. Constitution in this context, because I think that the Constitution really cannot be looked at objectively without thinking at the same time of the Declaration of Independence. I think they went hand in hand. But first, let me say something about why government officials all over the world were so terrified with the Declaration of Independence. Because once that idea seeps into people's consciousness that their rights come from nature and nature's God, not from government, every single government that's exercising and wielding an omnipotent control over people is threatened. I mean, all of a sudden, people are saying, well, wait a minute, if this right adheres not just to Americans, but to everybody, why are we having to live under a government that's destroying these rights, regulating these rights, controlling these rights? And that's why the Declaration of Independence and Thomas Jefferson put the fear of God in every single regime around the world. He continues to do that because of the danger that people are going to start thinking in terms of, we don't need to put up with this. But on the Constitution, they end up bringing into existence really what has to be the most unusual society in history. Now, we know there was one big tragic example to the principles we're talking about, and that's slavery. No question about that. But if you set aside that horrific exception, this has got to be the most unusual society that mankind has ever seen. I mean, let's leap up to 1890 to about 1910. This is my favorite time in history. I mean, if I had to choose a time to have been born in which to live, it would have been during this period of time. It had to be unbelievably exciting. Even though the standard of living obviously was lower than it is today, I would choose the lower standard of living to live in that kind of society. Imagine how unusual this society was. No income tax, no IRS audits, income tax returns, keeping track of your deductions. You kept 100% of what you earned. No Social Security, Medicare, welfare, food stamps, subsidies, or other welfare state programs. For all practical purposes, no immigration controls. I mean, they had a control system, but I would say, 98% of people could come in without any problems. You had no drug laws, no big drug war, no Pentagon, CIA, NSA, no European interventions, no empire military bases. They just had a basic military, no gun control, no torture, state-sponsored assassinations. I mean, I could go on and on. Very few economic regulations. I mean, among them was the Sherman Antitrust Act in 1890 or so. No minimum wage laws. It's an incredible period, and inventions were coming into existence every day. People were becoming paupers, going from paupers to millionaires in 1, 2, 3 generations. The greatest outburst of voluntary charity that mankind has ever seen. This is the kind of thing that came into existence because of what Jefferson said. They actually put these ideas into practice, except for slavery and other things like tariffs and women's rights. But they put into existence a society that by and large reflected what Jefferson was saying with unbelievably positive results. Standard of living of the American people was soaring, especially in that period of time, 1890 to 1910. Like I said, voluntary charity was just going through the roof. People helping other people purely on a voluntary basis. It was a phenomenal period. Unfortunately, it all got abandoned. And that's why we live under the kind of system we live today. And I think we need to recognize that, Richard, and emphasize it, that we live in a system today which changed radically during the 1930s, during the Franklin Roosevelt administration. I should mention also they had gold coins and silver coins as their official money back in 1890. And for more than 100 years, that was changed to the paper money system under Roosevelt. That everything changed, and that we live under a system that is really akin to the British Empire, against which the colonists rebelled. I mean, that's the real irony of this thing, is that we really live under omnipotent government now, power to assassinate people, tax people, take care of people. It's a totally different kind of system, but it's still, played out in the sense of, oh, we're celebrating the 4th of July and the Declaration of Independence, even though we live under a system that violates those principles.
Now, I'm like sort of, you mentioned the exceptions of slavery, lack of full and equal rights to women. A lot of people now, particularly under, progressivism, wokeism, political correctness, and so on, say, oh, this shows the hypocrisy of the Declaration, the hypocrisy of the Constitution. It has to be recalled, and it has to be appreciated in the proper historical context, Jacob, that before 1776, nobody believed in the declaring of individual rights, not just an abstract philosophical idea of John Locke in these 2 treatises on government, but the actual undertaking of overthrowing a monarchy in the name not of replacing him with another prince or a tyrant, but to free people on the basis that they have these unalienable rights. This is what made this experiment unique. All of human history before that was the presumption that there were the rulers and the rules, the determiners of people's status in life, and those who were the victims and had to live under it, and who had to bear under exploitation and oppression and plunder by those with the political power through the tradition of divine right of kings, were just out and out force. And suddenly this says individuals have rights. But you have to appreciate that this was a profoundly new idea. It is not surprising that it didn't instantaneously change everything in the society. After all of recorded history with slavery, and not just Africans brought to America, but since the beginning of time, the slaves of ancient Greece, the slaves of ancient China, the slavery in the Roman Empire, the serfdom of the Middle Ages. And then suddenly, there's the idea that each individual has these rights. Well, institutionally, the system has all of these embedded relationships. In the American southern states, colonies then, slavery was taken for granted. People's interests were tied to it, and people do not give up their narrow interests easily or without resistance in the name of a new abstract idea that is catching on in other people's minds. It was a transition period from slavery to liberty. That is what was enunciated in the Declaration of Independence. And that meant that in principle and by logic, slavery was going to have to end. Tragically, it ended through a very bloody and costly civil war. In Britain, they ended it by a vote of parliament, far less bloody and destructive. Tragically, in our country, it took a civil war. But once you stated those principles in the Declaration, you could not, if you believed and articulated them, accept this institution, which was an institution of the old regime, of the ancient past. It too was going to have to pass. And once you say that all men are created equal, and it was always understood that the word men was generic, it meant human beings, then inevitably women would have to have the same legal and franchise voting rights as men, as it proceeded to do as the 19th century progressed. The 19th century is the great century of having at the beginning enunciated the principle. And by the end of the century, certainly in the Western world, and then increasingly in other parts of the globe, the actual implementation of that universal principle of the individual rights of the human being. It was not hypocrisy, but the transition from the old to the new, and the institutional lags and resistances of vested interest who didn't want to give up their privileges and their favors and their status in society. But by the end of the 19th century, legally nowhere does slavery exist. Nowhere. And even where it is de facto continuing, it's an embarrassment. And certainly by the early 20th century, it's even more of an embarrassment that you might be in the Middle East, in Arab and Muslim countries, and their slavery might exist. But it is viewed as an embarrassment because you don't articulate and defend it as an institution anymore. That is what makes the Declaration in its historical uniqueness and importance. It heralded a new age for the world. And that is what we should be celebrating.
Yeah, that's a fascinating point. That the Declaration places Americans living at that time in the position of having to confront their own contradictions of the Declaration itself. Yeah, that's a very interesting point. I think it's also worth pointing out that we're not talking about democracy here. We're not celebrating democracy on the 4th of July. We're talking about freedom. And unfortunately, what all too many people are inculcated with is the notion that democracy is freedom. Well, there's nothing in the Constitution or the Declaration that talks about democracy as being freedom. In fact, democracy is a great threat to freedom. That's why you have the Bill of Rights that protects us from the majority. And the other thing that I think is fascinating about the Declaration of Independence was that on the 4th of July, or at least in 1776, was the same year that Adam Smith comes up with his monumental treatise on economic liberty called An Inquiry into the Nature and Causes of the Wealth of Nations, where he's trying to figure out what is it that causes wealth in nations? Why are there some nations that are wealthier than other nations? The common perception is, oh, because they have natural resources. They discovered oil or whatever. Smith says, oh, no. It's that when you have a system where government is not controlling economic activity, you will have higher standards of living. And so here's Jefferson saying, well, people have a right to engage in economic activity. That's part of life and liberty and property. That's how you sustain your life, through labor, through economic transactions with others, trades. Smith is saying, well, yeah, this is how you improve your standard of living. So, and Smith's book, as you know, Richard, it's a very turgid read for us today, but it was a popular best-selling book back there, especially among the American colonists, or I should say British colonists. And so when you put those two together, you end up with this fascinating society that really herald the way to the future. I mean, when you finally get rid of slavery and you equalize rights for women, and unfortunately, we've never gotten rid of tariffs and trade wars and so forth. But when you look at that, looking forward, you see, my gosh, this is society, humanity is going to advance with ever increasing higher standards of living and voluntary charity and so forth. And it all came to an end, though, with the 1930s and beyond, with the advent of the welfare warfare state, at least here in the United States. And unfortunately, there is no society that incorporates the principles of the Declaration of Independence anywhere in the world today.
But I would just say, in terms of everything we have been talking about, is that all those who celebrate the 4th of July and have a sense of its original importance and uniqueness should not in any way feel an embarrassment, an apology in the eyes of those who now criticize it. Oh, it's a subterfuge for male white domination of the weak and exploitation of women and people of color, which is the new defining attempt to basically delegitimize the founding of the United States, which we have been talking about and its underlying principle. That has to be rejected. That criticism has to be rejected, is an attempt to delegitimize the entire history of this country by attempting to delegitimize its founding principles. But its founding principles is what has given either itself or an inspiration for others whatever liberty and freedom and prosperity that other parts of the world have. It's the ideas behind the Declaration that have liberated mankind.
All right. Well, on that fine note, let's celebrate every 4th of July as really the key to mankind's betterment, the key to ending or significantly alleviating poverty, but most of all, the way to achieve liberty for people all over the world. Richard, on that note,
And I'll just say is that I'll just add that before we started, I told Jacob asked, what are we doing for the 4th of July? And I told them that my wife and I are hosting about 8 people, so there'll be a total of 10 of us. We like to celebrate the 4th of July. And this year, besides eating and cheering about, the Jefferson and the Declaration, we will be singing songs that Anna dug up. And these are old pro-freedom revolutionary songs from the 1770s during the Revolution. So we not only will be toasting American liberty, we will be singing the very songs that the defenders of liberty of that time were singing while standing up to the British.
That's awesome. Maybe we should see some videos of those online, Richard.
You never know.
All right. On that note, I want to wish you, Richard, a happy 4th. And well, no, I guess this is being shown after the 4th. I hope you had a good 4th of July.
Yes.
Richard. I hope everybody did. And Richard, I look forward to talking to you next time.
Until next time.